afternoon's talk is titled "Current State of Research in Liturgical Music in the Philippines During Spanish and American Colonial Periods." This is quite mouthful, but I guess we will be enlightened during the rest of the afternoon. So to start the program, I would like to call on a member of the Archdiocesan Commission for the Cultural Heritage of the Church, Mr. Louis Nacorda. Please ask the prayer.
Let's all rise. Ourselves in the presence of the King, in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord God, God of history, God of art, God of music, we're gathered here today to learn more about our musical colonial past. Send your Holy Spirit to enlighten the speaker and so the participants that we may learn, appreciate, and treasure our sacred music. This we ask through Christ our Lord. Amen. And the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Thank you, Louis. Before I call on the next person who should be here, I'd like to inform everybody that today's affair is first in a series of activities for this month's 12th anniversary celebration of the founding of the Archdiocesan Museum of the Archdiocesan Cebu. Now, I'd like to call on Father Brian Virgilio to give us more information about our speakers.
Welcome to the name. First and foremost, I'm very glad together with
I'm very thankful on behalf of first of the Commission for the Cultural Heritage in the Church to come over, even if the weather is not so favorable for us to gather this afternoon. But then again, nothing will really stop us from involving ourselves with heritage things, most especially things that entail to the life of our church. Because this afternoon we are very fortunate swiftly like that. It's because of our speaker this afternoon is spending time and his expertise in sharing the very fruit of his research. Even though this is not yet I think this is still a work in progress. But then again, very essential for us to acquaint ourselves with, because our professor would be, our guest speaker would be bringing us back to the musical heritage of the Hispanic Church. Listening, appreciating, and even inculcating in our very selves the very rich historical, rich heritage of musical heritage of the church during the Hispanic times. What are the songs they're singing? What are the patterns or tunes that they are chanting? And because we all know that the sacred music is the soul to the encounter of the artisan. It's just like on the task given to the ecclesiastical arts, that they are efficacious signs that will aid our soul and our spirit to the encounter of the artisan himself. I met this speaker 2 years ago during the recent biennial convention for all the church heritage workers that was held in Social Points, this topic was about the music during the Hispanic times, and it really fosters concern and interests the listeners, to the heritage workers. So So also coupled with the other thought on the high importance, they are really complementing to each other. And the good thing of that thought is that we were able to hear and see recreated music. It's not just about information of the music in Islamic times, but He has given us this opportunity to listen, opportunity to view the very music that our forefathers were singing and participating in the celebration of the universe. Our speaker this afternoon, of course, Dr. Kendall, is an assistant professor of music at Msgr University in Riverside, California. And he is also serving as a visiting professor of musicology at the University of the Philippines, Diliman. He received his master's and PhD degrees in historical musicology from the University of California, Riverside, writing a dissertation on liturgical music in the Spanish Colonial Philippines. Dr. Kendall regularly publishes and presents research on Filipino liturgical music, organology, music theory, and the critical reception of religious music. He is currently on a 6-month research sabbatical from the La Sierra University of California, working on liturgical music culture in the Central Visayas. He is currently staying in Quezon City with his wife, Filipina, Sheila from Davao City, and daughters, Carmina and Mikhaila. Thank you, friends. We welcome Dr. Kendall.
Before we give you Dr. Kendall, I'd like to say that Father Brian Virgilio just spoke. He's currently the chair of the Archdiocesan Commission as Cultural Heritage of the Church. And several other commission members are here. There's Louis Nacorda, there's Orlando Tumada, and there's former Mayor Micah, and myself, my husband. And from Frankie Despy, what else is here?
Our friend of the
Yeah, there are several visitors from choirs here, including Dennis Sudaro of the Children's Choir. So now we're very honored to present to you Dr. David.
Thank you and good afternoon. I hope you can hear well enough.
Yes.
Good. So I won't have to use my teaching voice, which will probably crack the beams and destroy the roof. I was at the Msgr Oriental State University last week presenting without a microphone to about 70 music education students, and I used my teaching voice. But before I begin, let me just say that the research that I'm doing, those of us who are involved in cultural heritage research, it is very easy to maybe lose the focus of what the purpose of the research is, or what the purpose of the materials that we're researching. And the primary purpose is indeed, as Father Brian was just saying, to the greater glory of God. I just wanted to make it's easy to lose yourself in documents and translations and forget that this was a living musical tradition meant specifically for the glory of God. And anyway, good afternoon and thank you for your warm welcome. Thanks to the Archdiocesan Cultural Heritage Chair, Father Brian Virgilio, for his support of my research here in the Archdiocese, and also to Cultural Heritage Secretary Gerard Desicado for his excellent assistance. I'm excited and encouraged to speak to you, members of the Heritage Circle. I'm excited to meet kindred spirits interested in many of the same issues that I am, and encouraged because so often the attitude of those who hear about our efforts in heritage documentation and preservation is ambivalence, or occasionally even hostility. The best counter to the attitude that the materials of the past are dead or irrelevant is the work and advocacy that we are doing here. I'm currently, as you heard, on a 6-month research sabbatical from a university in the United States, and during that time, I've been looking into liturgical musical of the areas of the central diocese under the administration of the Augustinian Recollect Order and also the Augustinian Order. I have focused my efforts on the dioceses of Taligon and Tagbilaran and Bohol, the Diocese of Dumaguete, including Siquijor, and the Archdiocese of Cebu. I have done quite a bit of previous work in Bohol, in the Dipolog area, in Manila, San Fernando, Pampanga, Pangasinan, and the Ilocos region. But it was on the suggestion of the archivist of the University of Santo Tomas Archives, Professor Ricky Jose, that I focused my research in the way that I am now. Though I originally conceived of this work being limited to the Spanish colonial period, I'm finding many important things in the American period as well, which is why I updated it to include that. But I'm not going to give a very detailed analysis of my specific current research here, except as it amplifies general principles of liturgical music in the Philippines. To begin, I will give a brief history from the first Spanish contacts with the Philippines and the first few generations of colonization, a little of the succeeding centuries, until the 19th century, where we have a lot more documentary evidence. The first sustained encounter that Filipinos likely had with Western liturgical music, or Western music of any kind, was during Magellan's expedition in 1521, when the accompanying priests celebrated Mass. Since Magellan was able to convert a number of chieftains while in the disciples, there was probably many instances where people heard priests singing portions of the Mass. However, given the rather sudden departure of Magellan's expedition, this music was probably not influential on local musical styles, or at least not for long. More influential, of course, was the image of the Santo Niño, which was found decades later by Legazpi's expedition. But to find evidences of the early musical colonization of the Philippines, we have to look at early accounts of Spanish missionaries, colonial officials, and travelers. One of the best early accounts is that of Father Pedro Quirino, a Jesuit priest who served in the Philippines from 1590 to 1602, and wrote this account, or Relación, in Rome in 1604. Father Quirino worked in Luzon, Panay, Leyte, Cebu, Bohol, and Mindanao, so his account is very valuable because it describes many different places, contexts, and situations. It is also valuable because it shows the impact that Spanish liturgical music had after just one or two generations of colonization. But I would like to take a moment to pause and say something about these historical accounts. While history is indeed an academic discipline, it is not strictly scientific and based on controlled data, like reading calculus equations or the results of chemistry experiment. History is tied with historiography, and historiography is about how histories are written, whose perspective is the history coming from, and what decisions are being made about what to include and what to exclude from the account. So if you were reading a history from a Spanish Jesuit priest in the Philippines, you have to know that he has a particular perspective. He is interested primarily in converting Filipinos to Catholicism, and as a Spaniard, you may also be interested in the political alignment of the new colony with Spain. This is the essence of historiography, and it is impossible to avoid in history, but important to keep in mind whether you are reading Spanish accounts, the works of Jose Rizal, books by American colonial officials, or even modern history textbooks. Okay. Returning to Father Quirino, given the fact that his perspective was that of a Spanish Jesuit priest, as I just mentioned, I find his account to be very believable for one good reason. He talks about both the positive and the negative. He mentions the successes of colonization and evangelization, and also the failures. It was otherwise common in these kinds of accounts that the author would only talk about the wonderful successes and the perfect religious or political societies that they were building. And they usually did this because they were asking Rome or Spain for more money, and they didn't want to hurt their chances of receiving this money by talking about failures that they had had. Father Quirino was at the time that he wrote this report already back in Rome, and I believe he is describing things honestly as he experienced. From his account, it appears that music was an important part of religious life both in Manila and in the provinces. It was used in two major ways. One, it was used in solemn settings, such as the celebration of masses and the divine offices of the Liturgy of the Hours of religious communities. And two, it was used as a tool in teaching, specifically in religious education. When missionary priests first entered an area, they would first teach the very basics of the faith, known as the Doctrina Christiana. Doctrinas in the major Philippine languages were common during the colonial period, and a famous example was this 1593 version prepared by the Dominicans in Manila, written in Spanish and by Banin script, which you can see here, and also in Tagalog using the Roman alphabet. They also produced one in Chinese the same year. The missionary priests soon discovered that the easiest way to teach the Doctrina was through singing. In an example from Negros, early missionaries would first teach the Doctrina to the children, who would then teach their parents and their elders. Around Vespers time in the evening, the children would form a procession from the church into the town, who would gather the elders who would follow them back to the church, where they would also recite the doctrines together. According to Father Quirino, some people would stay up all night long singing and reciting. In Lobo, he observed the children would sing the Doctrina as they walked along the Lobo River. In this way, the missionary priests were able to establish strong local religious communities. After a region was reached and these local communities established, music could still be used to expand and consolidate these gains. In Tigbawan, in Panay, the church constructed a large school for boys that taught them reading, writing, and music. Each week, a team of 2 boys each would go out into the villages surrounding Tigbawan to lead the people in singing the Doctrina. In Manila, from around the same time, choirs and orchestras made up of Filipino parishioners were active, and records show us that this was the case throughout the Philippines, throughout the colonial era, culminating in the career of Marcelo Alonay, Msgr de Capilla at San Agustin in Intramuros at the end of the Spanish and early American periods. So this strong liturgical musical culture necessitated an equally strong system of music education. This was accomplished through institutions such as the Colegio de Niños Tigres and music training programs in the large mother churches in Manila, as well as cathedrals and parish churches throughout the Philippines. As to what they were taught, this can be gleaned from both the written accounts of the observers in the Philippines, as well as through Spanish language music treatises that circulated all over the Spanish colonial world, including the Philippines. Here is one. This is the title page to a music theory treatise by Francisco Marcos y Navas, published in Madrid in 1777 and widely circulated to the furthest reaches of the Spanish colonial world, being found in the California missions and in Bohol. It is entitled Arte o Compendio General de Cantoyano, Figurado y Ordeno, translated as The Art or General Summary of Plain Chant, Figured Chant, and Polyphony. These 3 cantos, or types of music, are important in understanding liturgical music in the Philippines or in any Spanish colonial territory. Canto llano is plain chant, or Gregorian chant, as it is more commonly known. Plain chant does not have a regular rhythmic pulse or meter. Its rhythm is determined by the natural rhythm of the other underlying Latin text. To illustrate this, I'm going to sing a couple of examples of plain chant that you can actually see displayed upstairs here in this very museum. The first, here on the left, is the dialogue between Christ and Simon Peter after the resurrection. Oh, sorry, yes, on the left. And I'll sing it without the microphone. Simon Ioannis, Iligis Medusis, Domine, Omnia Nostri, Muses Domine, Via Amote. And the next example on the right is an antiphon for the Vespers for the Nativity of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Nativitas est hodie sancte Mariae, Virginis, cuius vita in vita cuncas, illustra ecclesias. I'm not good at singing loud. The next common style figurado, which is a kind of chant with rhythm and meter. The interesting thing about canto figurado is that it allows for rhythm and meter, like I just mentioned, but it only allows for 4 note values and 2 rhythms, as you can see here. There are just 4 note values, longa, breve, semi-breve, and minima, and only 2 rhythms or 2 meters, duple and triple, or 2/4 and 3/4. So it's a very limiting style. I will sing an example of a Benedictus from an early 19th century source from Bohol, and notice the limited note values from the previous slide that I mentioned. So you can hear it in a more complete context. Let's listen to another setting, or a Kyrie from the same book from 1826 in Bohol, which includes the organ accompaniment part. This is sung by members of the choir at my university at Msgr. So you can see the simplicity of that music from that example. The third type of music found in the treatises is canto de organo, which means polyphonic music. You can see here, canto de organo is simply all the rhythmic values and meters that we know in modern music. Despite the fact that the shapes of the note heads are slightly different, they're kind of diamonds instead of, or lozenges instead of circles, but you can recognize that as modern music notation. Okay, so canto de organo is just simply modern music or polyphonic music. Here's an example of canto de organo from the Katipunan Church in San Juan del Norte. Since I can't sing all these parts, much less the organ part, I'm going to play this particular one a little later with the organ and voices complete. But this kind of canto de organo music that was common from the 16th century onward, and I'm going to play an example by the Italian composer Giovanni Pierluigi da Palestrina. Domingo de Salazar, the first bishop of Manila, had a book of works by Palestrina. So we know that music just like this was performed very early in the colonial Philippines. So I'm going to play it just as an example. The first Kyrie for Palestrina's Pope Marcellus Nas. Before I move on, I want to mention something related to the translation of musical terms that I've just been discussing. We know that the history of the Philippines has much to do with language. There are many languages and dialects in the country today, and there were there before the Spanish came. Chinese and Arabic and other languages were also known here. Add to that mix of Spanish and Latin to a certain extent, and then English under the American period, and we have a very multilingual environment. But since nearly all of the early documents about the Philippines are in Spanish, it's important to know at least some Spanish when studying this time period. But a general knowledge of Spanish is not always enough. Now, specific topics like music have their own special vocabularies in every language, including Spanish. And it really does take a musician to understand music. So if you rely on an English or other translation of a Spanish account, like the one by Father Pedro, the possibility exists that the translator will not know the true meanings of all the musical terms. Another factor that makes this even more complicated is that the meanings of the terms change over time. So a Spanish musical term used by Father Quirino in 1604 may not have the same meaning in 2016, even to a Spanish-speaking musician. This is the situation we have with the 55 volumes of translated documents by Emma Blair and James Alexander Robertson. These volumes were meant to provide many primary source documents related to the Philippines to readers in English. And even after well over 100 years, it is still often the primary source for research into the Spanish colonial Philippines. It certainly was for me. I think these were published in 1906. I did eventually learn, however, that when I was able to compare the Blair and Robertson translations to editions in the original Spanish, that the musical terms were often not accurate. A good example is the one we just talked about, the canto de órgano. When we look at this term, the meaning of the two main words seems clear. Canto means song or chant, and organo seems to mean organ, like a pipe organ. While the first term canto can be accurately translated as song or chant, organo is deceiving. Organo does mean organ, but not in the context of canto de órgano. The translators in the Blair and Robertson volumes translated each of the words one by one so that canto de órgano becomes chant of organ or chant of the organ. And eventually chant accompanied by the organ, since chant of organ doesn't make any sense. Canto de órgano as a term really means polyphony, which is clear when you see the dozens of Spanish language music theory texts in the colonial area. And I've collected digital copies of about 40 of these. And canto de órgano is always polyphonic music. Okay, so this is found in the Philippines, is canto llano, plain chant, figurado, figure chant, canto de órgano, polyphony. But because the translators didn't know this, a very simple phrase from the account of Father Virgilio that Spanish priests taught Filipinos canto llano y canto de órgano becomes plain chant and chant accompanied by the organ. Now you may say, who cares? This is a relatively small mistake, but it is not so small. Polyphonic music, or canto de órgano, was considered the most complex and advanced music. It required the most training and the most skill to perform properly. So to be able to perform polyphonic music means that one has achieved the highest possible talent in music. So for canto de órgano to be reduced to chant accompanied by the organ means, if read this way, it means that Filipinos did not attain the highest levels of musicality. And this point was noted by authors in the 20th century who read the Blair and Robertson volumes. And they said, see, the Spaniards did not teach Filipinos everything they knew about music, and they were deliberately holding them back so that they wouldn't achieve their full potential. If you think this is too much of a stretch for me to say, you should read some of these accounts in the 20th century that make this exact argument. Okay. So just as I said that we must be careful when reading historical accounts because of the different perspectives of the authors due to historiography, we should be careful when reading translated documents too. Now, Blair and Robertson did not have any intention of making this mistakes. They were just simply not experts in music and didn't know the mistakes that they were making. So my advice to those of us who are involved in heritage is if you run into a fantastic claim or an impossible situation, it's probably a translation mistake. Or maybe it's fantastic and incredible, but likely a translation mistake. Now with that out of the way, I'm going to show you some of the different kinds of musical sources that have been rediscovered up until now in the Philippines, along with the ways I've been categorizing them. There are a large number of ways to organize and categorize musical sources. One of the most common methods is by the time period of production. Because sources from before 1800s, before the 19th century, are very rare in the Philippines, the first time period I usually use includes musical sources produced up until the 1840s, because these have similar characteristics. Manuscripts from this time period are characterized by their sturdy construction, often of thick vellum pages made of cowskin with heavy wood and carabao skin bindings. And they're largely local manufacture, using local scriptorial writing and decorative artwork. The earliest source of this type that I have discovered that I can reasonably date is a set of 2 choir books, or cantorales, from here in Cebu. But they are currently housed in the San Agustin Museum in Intramuros, and dated, I think, from the 1730s. If you look closely, you can see the name of Father Juan Alara, of course, who built the basilica, and of course the name Santo Niño de Cebu. So probably 1730s, maybe at latest 1740. Other sources in this first category are the family of Popolano cantorales from the 1820s, 30s, and 40s. Most of them are easy to date and place due to surviving title pages, such as this 1827 collection of Mass Prompters, and this similar 1837 collection from Lobo. Sometimes the cantorales are incomplete and missing their title pages, but other clues can help to identify the sources. As in this case, we can determine that this incomplete cantoral is from Maribojo in Bohol, because the name of the priest is written below the table of contents. And due to Professor Ricky Jose's excellent work in his books, Curas de Almas, I can determine that this priest served in Maribojo in the 1840s. Also, this cantoral includes special liturgies for the Feast of St. Vincent Ferrer, and we know that the parish of Maribojo, of blessed memory, is a shrine to that saint, or was a shrine to that saint. Other similar sources are scattered throughout the Philippines, though many are difficult to date conclusively, such as this one from the Santa Maria Church in Ilocos Sur, whose title page looks like it was discovered along with the Dead Sea Scrolls. Among these inconclusively dated sources are the relatively large number of cantorales housed in San Agustin, including the 2 ones from Cebu that I mentioned, including misals, kyriales, antiphanaries, and psalteries. This is a misal open to the introit to the Feast of the Finding of the Holy Cross. You can see some nice decorative artwork there. This next example is an antiphanary turned to the Feast of St. Joseph of Calasanz. And one way we can try to find when the sources were produced is the saints that are included. So Joseph of Calasanz was a Spanish priest born in 1557, died in 1648, and was canonized in 1767. So we know that this cantoral had to have been made after 1767. Other similar examples exist in the Ilocos region, in Pangasinan, and in Pampanga. The craftsmanship demonstrated in these families of sources is often very high, with skilled scribal work and beautiful initials and decorations, and sometimes colorful and whimsical illustrations or illuminations, as well as some elaborate and interesting devotional folk art. Let's just take a moment to look through some of these beautiful, this is all examples of local Filipino devotional artwork. These are all initials here. This is from the inside cover of a cantoral from Loay in Bohol. This is an interesting, full of, these are all Marian symbols. This is found in Baclayo. You see the snake over the crescent moon below the crowned Marian monogram. which makes sense since the Church of Baclayon is the Immaculate Conception. The second period we used to categorize musical sources is from about 1850 to the end of the Spanish colonial period in 1898. This period is categorized by mostly printed rather than written sources of liturgical music, ones that were often imported from Spain. There are also handwritten examples of devotional or extra liturgical music as well. An important example of printed sources is the sets of cantoradas by José Juan Santisteban, who produced at least 3 editions of liturgical music in the 1850s and 1860s. These came, you could purchase them in a set of 6 large cantoradas with a treatise on cantoriano and figurado and an organ accompaniment, so 8 altogether. Records show that many parish churches in the Philippines purchased these sets in the 1860s, and there are large collections of them still in the University of the Assumption in San Fernando, Pampanga, in the Manila Arzobispado, and the largest one, the collection right here in the Archdiocesan Museum. Jordan, how many did we find? 12? 10. We found 10. So there were a large number. We just kept finding them when I was photographing them. There was always more. The format and musical style are very similar to the written cantoradas. Of course, they're printed instead of written, though with much less color, limited decorative initials, and no illuminations. So you can experience it better. Let's listen to something from this book, A Chorus Angelorum from the Requiem Liturgy for Men's Trio. Actually, before you hear, you can see. So this is for trio, 3 parts, and originally, this top part was not red, it was actually hollow. But it was made red for a very, if you read music, if you're reading 3 parts all closely spaced together, it's easy to lose your place. Like, wait, which one was that? Especially if you're singing the middle voice. Wait, am I here, here, here? So the red voice means that if you're singing the top part, you can always follow your voice, and then the other ones, you're the top black one or the bottom black one. So this is for unaccompanied, I think, unaccompanied men's trio, so let's listen to A Chorus Angelorum. Another set of printed sources are several volumes of small format cantoradas. And when I make the difference, when I'm talking about large format and small format, I'll show you a picture in a little while just so you know what I mean. When I mean large format, the pages of the book are like this. Very, very large format. When I mean small format, I mean like normal book size. And the reason these large cantoradas are so large is for a very simple fact. Books are expensive, especially when you're making them out of cow skin. If you've ever been to Bohol, has anyone ever been to the museum in the Colonial Church in Bohol and seen the large cantoradas there? Or have you been to San Agustin and seen the large cantoradas that are in the portal? They're huge. Oh, and so heavy because they're made of cow skin, this thick, with wood carabao hide. Because I've carried each one of those. I know how heavy they are. And but the purpose is because just to get 4 sheets, I believe it's 4 sheets of paper for the cantoral, you have to kill 1 cow. So imagine if you want, some of you are taking notes, to get 4 sheets of paper, you had to kill a chicken or a goat or a cow. Paper is expensive. Nowadays, paper is relatively inexpensive. I mean, how much does 1 sheet of paper cost? Less than a peso, nobody knows. So, paper was expensive when made of cow skin like that. So you could only afford in a parish 1 set of liturgical choir books. And so you would have them, and they needed to be very large. So when you put them on a lectern, a facisto, a rotating lectern, it looks like a pyramid, you could put them at a far distance. And if we had one here, I could put it, here in this position. And depending upon your eyesight, I probably couldn't see it without my glasses from the back, but most of us would be able all to read that music. And so instead of needing how many people are in the room, maybe 30 or 40, instead of needing 30 or 40 choir books, we only had 1. So that was the purpose behind having the large format cantorales, because while cowskin and even paper was relatively expensive, that's why it needed to be. So this example is actually a small format cantoral, and it was printed for the Sisters of Santa Clara in Manila in the 1870s. So this is actually a printed set from the Philippines. And these are one of the few surviving musical settings actually printed in the Philippines during the Spanish period. And like the Santa Esteban cantorales, the big ones, they're found all over the Philippines, including Baclayon in Bohol, Shatong in Negros Oriental, and Sibonga here in South Cebu. They actually have canto piano, figurado, and organo. This particular one is using canto de organo style that we talked about. And let's listen to an example from this source. It's a Dies Irae, again from the Requiem Mass, for 2 soprano parts and bass. addition to these printed sources, there are also some other handwritten sources dating from this era as well. Some of this material takes the form of organ accompaniment books, like this one from Bohol, undated but likely from this era, and this 1893 incomplete organ score from Bacalao. The third time period is characterized by much less use, at least as far as the surviving sources tell us, of the larger format matorales, and more use of smaller format solo and choral works with keyboard accompaniment, and an increased use of Spanish language devotional music in addition to Latin liturgical music. This music is relatively easy to date and to categorize both generally and specifically. Generally, because the music is often written on staff paper and in music sketchbooks that obviously date from the American colonial period, as in these examples. Note the Carl Fisher trademark at the bottom of the page. This music sketchbook may have been produced in the Philippines, but the use of English, of course, dates to the American period. This is common. Also, the name of the composer is included, and we can reference the name of this composer through baptismal marriage and burial records. Additionally, we can see that the composer or transcriber used relatively cheap black ink, probably from a ballpoint pen that is faded to blue. Fortunately, in several cases, the composers and arrangers were kind enough to provide dates, often to the very month and day of the completion of the work. One of the most influential events in liturgical music during this period was the 1937 Eucharistic Congress in Manila, and the collection of sacred music produced by Augustinian Recollect Father Domingo Castiller that year. This collection went to another edition in 1952 and is still being used in many parishes today. I know at least in Negros Oriental, many of the choir directors are still singing from this every Sunday, the Spanish ones. The next set of categories are clearer and generally easier to define. The next category relates to the ritual function of the music. First example is music that is strictly liturgical, used in the Holy Mass, the Liturgy of the Hours, and other ritual functions under the direct jurisdiction of diocesan hierarchies. So this may include settings of Mass ordinaries, here's a Kyrie, settings of Mass propers in Cantoyano, or plain chant, settings for specific feasts in the divine offices, like Vespers, and psalteries for the weekly chanting of the Psalms. Other common examples are settings of the Officio de Folklore, Requiem. And the other part of this category is one that deals with non-liturgical devotional music in general. So this might include hymns, motets, and villancicos used in and around liturgical elements, such as during communion, but not using a liturgical text, and typically one in Spanish, as this one is. Other examples may be found for other functions, like corporate and personal Marian devotions, etc. Okay, the production method, whether something is written or printed. I'm just going to show you a few pictures here. Another category, easy to define, is whether or not the source is written or printed. Among surviving sources in the Philippines, nearly everything before 1850, or from the first time period, is written, and typically in a very large format. You can see me measuring one there, and made of very durable materials such that almost 200 years later, often they're in good shape. And these were meant to be used for long periods of time and by large numbers of people. Everything in the second and third time periods is roughly evenly split between written and printed sources. But later printed sources are typically smaller format and created in a less durable fashion due to the nature of their usage as organ accompaniment sources or individual instrumental or vocal parts. The same is true of written sources. When they're smaller format, they tend to travel around and get lost or get damaged or thrown into the bodega, or they end up at the house of where the local parish musicians were. I probably find music like this in people's personal collections almost as often as I find them in churches. And the origin of printed and written works is another important category. Some examples are obvious. This example includes the name of the parish church for which it was produced, suggesting that it was made locally. So this is for the church at Loay, 1841. Other information, such as parish receipts, expenditure records, and inventories, can provide some insights. as in this example, showing the costs related to the acquisition of vellum sheets and for hiring a composer and a music scribe. Other clues can be found in the instructional rubrics or directions for performance within the sources themselves. So here in the upper picture, there are instructional rubrics and the title of the Mass proper setting in Visayan, if you can see it. Mass for the Three Kings, and then at the top, telling you where to go, it's all in Visayan. So this points to local manufacture and use. This is not for the purpose or this is not for the benefit of priests reading this music. It's the benefit of local Visayan-speaking parishioners who are literate who can read this. Similarly, if you look at the bottom, there's the use of Ilocano in the lower picture in this cantoral from Santa Maria, Ilocos Sur. This printed cantoral was produced in Spain and exported to the Philippines. And this graduale was probably printed in either Italy or Spain and subsequently imported. Handwritten sources are usually easier to place because someone will put the name of the place they were when they finished. All right. The final category I'm going to discuss, and this can be one of the most depressing or discouraging, is that of the condition of the source or manuscript. It is always a pleasure to encounter a manuscript in very good condition, where the source is complete and when applicable with the binding fully intact and when there is little sign of wear or damage. I'm just going to tell you, it's very rare to find something in this condition. Here's one. In this cantoral from San Agustin, the source is complete and bound, though I know this is not the original binding. But if you look at it, it's complete, it's well bound. The folios are crisp with only the slightest wear at the corners where the pages are turned, and the colors are uniformly sharp and unfaded, which actually tells me I think this book was probably not used very much. A source in good condition generally at least has a partial binding, as in this example from Baclayon and Bohol. Here the wood and carabao hide binding remains, but shows degradation due to heavy use. The folios themselves are complete, but with some noticeable wear along the edges and corners, fading of the colors, and a small amount of water damage. You can see on the bottom part, either water or fire. Actually, I think water and fire damage, both. It's probably where the candle was, where they used to illuminate it. A source in fair condition often does not include any binding at all and may be incomplete. This example from a cantoral produced in Lobos, in Bohol, but currently housed in the Intramuros administration, is not bound, is missing about half its original folio pages, and while it does not show heavy wear and fading, it does exhibit some very, very severe water damage in the bottom right corner. This source from Loa is unbound and incomplete, though it's not very color faded. It has some water damage, is torn in a number of places, and shows other damage from fire and insects. And insect damage is some of the worst for the paper examples here. You find things, and you'll find so many little intricate wormholes where they've just eaten their way all the way through and made their little nests inside. A poor source is one that has significant damage and or wear, such that it is difficult to decipher, more than 50% incomplete, or has some other serious deficiency. There is a folio from another one, Boholang Cantoral, I think it's one from Dawis. It's so severely faded that a lot of it is not legible. And the source includes only a few dozen of the 200 plus original folios. This folio was vandalized and defaced by a Pentel pen. And this one was repurposed into a drumhead. With this in mind, let me just briefly list some of the places where I found significant or interesting musical sources so we get an idea of the possible distribution. Keeping in mind, of course, that I have not yet visited every diocese and parish in the Philippines, maybe by the end of my life. So here are some sources in Luzon. Here are some in Metro Manila. The sources that are in the Intramuros administration are all from Bohol. I don't know how they got there. But actually good thing, because the sources from Lobo and Mariboho are there. Especially the one from Mariboho, it would have been destroyed along with the church. And probably Lobo, because the Lobo Museum was also destroyed. Here's Lobo. And the reason there's so many sources here are probably mostly because I've spent most of my time in Lobo. And from Cebu and Negros. I haven't spent much time in it now. Speaking of Katipunan, let's listen. I told you earlier in the talk that I would let you listen to a piece of music from Katipunan. This is actually a devotional piece in Spanish. It's very good. It sounds very much like folk music, so let's listen to this one. It's just for ladies' voices. This is a plegaria or prayer for women. One of the things I'm particularly interested in are how those repertories of liturgical and devotional music were disseminated, how they traveled from place to place. This happened in two major ways in the Philippines. First, authors of theoretical treatises often composed Mass and hymn settings, placing them in the treatise to illustrate concepts set down already in the text, as this example from the Musicology treatise that I already mentioned you can find here in the Philippines, where the author composes several full Mass settings to show different methods of using canto figurado. Sometimes the author of a treatise would use instead a well-known Mass setting to illustrate a concept, as in this example from an 1848 treatise by Jaime Miguel Vázquez. This setting of the Credo, which is this one here, Credo Parisiense, is also found in the whole repertoire. In each of these cases, the repertories would go where the treatises went, usually in the personal possession of individual priests or in parish libraries. The second way in which these kinds of repertories were spread was through the dissemination of manuscript copies or collections of settings. Again, these settings were most likely spread through the agency of individual priests, many of whom were moving from larger metropolitan centers like Sevilla, Madrid, Valladolid, or even Mexico City to missionary outposts at the edges of the Spanish colonial world and beyond. The next example is a fascinating exemplar of this method of spreading repertoire, and we're going to follow two threads of its distribution in two different directions. So the title of this Mass is Misa de Trompas, or Horn Mass, though it is later mistranslated as Trumpet Mass. It was composed by Don José Mir y Justa while he was the Maestro de Capilla at the Segovia Cathedral in 1736. He later moved to the Cathedral of Valladolid and then Madrid. The original manuscript has not yet been found, but a copy, dated 1790, ended up in the possession of John Gordon, the vice rector of the Royal Scots College in Valladolid. When I say the Royal Scots College, this is important. The Catholic Church was outlawed in Scotland at this time, and it was illegal to celebrate Mass until some measure of religious freedom was restored by the Scottish Catholic Relief Act of 1793. Up until that time, Scottish priests would be trained in Spain and have to sneak back into Scotland and celebrate Mass in the dead of night, and generally in silence, as attending Mass could carry the death penalty. In that milieu, it is no surprise that Scottish singing and choral practice was in need of some revival. Newly formed Scottish church choirs needed a style of music relatively limited in scope and easy to teach and learn, canto figurado. So the simple style of canto figurado was perfect for this project, and as the now legal parish priests had all been trained in Spain, they had a large repertoire from Spain to teach their choirs. So by 1808, we see a version of the Misa de Trompas performed for Easter Sunday at the Archdiocesan College in Inverary, where several professors were graduates of the Royal Scotch College in Madrid. Later, in 1829, George Gordon, relation to John as far as I know, produced a collection of sacred music and organ accompaniment, including the now misnamed Trumpet Mass. He engaged masters of eminence in the city of Edinburgh to expand the single vocal line, as you see this is just a single part before, into a trio, and add an organ part. George Gordon was also trained in Spain, such that they called his nickname was Don Jorge. So these different versions are nearly identical. If you read music, you can see the melodic structure. If you just look at the first 5 or 6 measures, you'll see they're almost identical. The only difference is the underlay of the text. It's the same. The top part, basically the same. They've changed the key. I don't know how the setting got to the Philippines, but I suspect that I'm someday going to find a Misa de Trompas in a Mexican parish archive. It's possible that it arrived directly from Spain, but it likely had a stop in Mexico between its composition in 1736 and its first instance in the Philippines nearly a century later, where it's found in the Kyrie de Baclayon, produced in 1826, and all the other Bobolano sources. So I've been talking so far only about musical manuscripts, and I don't want you to think that that's the only thing that's important. There are other sources that we can use to learn about liturgical and sacred music in the Philippines that are not directly musical sources themselves. Very often, church museums will still have musical instruments, and the churches themselves may have a pipe organ, or at least the remains of a pipe organ, or other keyboard instruments such as a harmonium. But the most important records that we can find in churches to learn about their musical life outside of the manuscripts themselves. And that list that I gave you of all the places in the Philippines, that's just where they have musical manuscripts. These parish records that I'm talking about are found in probably 3, 4, 5 times as many places, which is most of the work that I've been doing. So let me show you them. First, there's inherent challenges in dealing with these records. One is the simple fact that the records, just like musical manuscripts, are made of paper and exist in a rainy and humid environment with many insects and pests. Here you can see some moderate water damage that has faded and washed away some of the ink. Here's some more moderate damage from wormholes in a source from Cebu. And around the middle of the 19th century, ink made with some sort of lead acid or gall was really popular, but it was very damaging to the underlying paper, as you can see here in this book from the Basilica here. It makes it very difficult, if not impossible at times, to decipher, and blackened and spread, and eventually just blows away like dust. But now, those are the difficulties. Let's talk about the sources themselves. Parish inventories are usually known simply as libros de inventario, and they typically list the common properties of the church, such as liturgical vestments, santos, ornaments, chalices, candlesticks, books, including music books, and musical instruments. Inventories are very useful because they list all of the church properties in one place, and we can see how items in the parish inventory are added, lost, or wear out over time. For instance, you can see, not in this particular list, but in an inventario in 1850, you'll see that they purchased a misal, and it'll say, un misal nuevo, a new misal. But by 1870, it has become un misal viejo, an old misal. Or a silver chalice that was one owned by the parish will later have a note saying, no existe, it's gone. It doesn't exist, meaning that it was lost, stolen, or thrown away. So you can see the usefulness of such a book with this page. This is from Borgoon here in South Cebu, listing the musical instruments of the parish in 1897. So this was their band. So we know the instruments that they owned. If a parish church is fortunate, they will have an inventory book as well as a book of receipts and expenses. These books have a number of names, sometimes called Libro de Cuentas, Libro de Cargo y Data, or Libro de Recibo y Gasto. In rare cases, as in the books, again here from the Basilica, there is a separate Libro de Recibo here, and then another Libro de Gasto, because they had so many expenses and things going in and out, they had to separate the books. I'm also coming to learn about the importance of the confratrias, or confraternities, the importance that they played in the musical life of the parish churches. They often were in charge of decorating the church and providing food during the fiestas of their devoted saint, and also providing music and sometimes musical instruments to the church. Here is a book from Bantayan for the Confratia del Sagrado Corazón de Jesús, a book of receipts for the Confratia de la Correa and Anda, Bohol, and a similar book for the same Confratia that I got to see for the first time yesterday in Bohol. The most important and interesting events in the life of the parish church involved expenditures. Some expenses were common and are found regularly in the parish records from month to month. These can include expenditures for common needs like mass wine, incense, and wheat for hosts, and candles. So let's just look at these. So in Bacon, in Negros, 3 crates of wine, which would supply them for about 6 months. In the mid-19th century cost 24 pesos, 7 reales, 10 granos. Those are the fractional currency. So a peso was divided into 8 reales. That's where you get the pieces of 8 pirates. The pirate parrots on the shoulder of the pirate always says pieces of 8. They're referring to Spanish currency. And then granos were even smaller than that. Here for wheat and incense for Bantayan, 1 year's supply of wheat. This is for making hosts. And for incense, 4 pesos, 4 reales, 4.5 pesos. And in Iritila, 4 months supply of candles were 15 pesos. So you have an idea of the general expenses for the churches. This also included salaries for church employees, such as the parish secretary, the laundry woman, the choir director, the organist, and the porter. These workers usually made around 1 peso per month, and sometimes 2 pesos. But let me tell you a little bit about their salaries. In addition to the salary that they received, 1 peso or 2 pesos per month, they also received some food subsidy, and they were also exempt from the tribute tax. Okay, the tribute tax, tributa, was a tax during the Spanish colonial period on individuals. So it would be like, I don't know what you would call it. It's not an income tax, but it's a tax on, I think, adults above 16 years old. And part of that was actually given back to the church, called the Sanctorum tax, was given back to the church to support them. But they were parish employees, including church singers and musicians, were exempt from this tax. So they received the salary and also tax exemption and some food subsidy. One would imagine making 1 peso per month. Okay, so other expenses, these are regular expenses, salaries for parish employees. You see these every month. But other could be occasional in nature and sometimes involve building projects. So the Bantayan Church, for example, spent many hundreds of pesos from 1850 to 1853 preparing materials for a new church building, including salaries for workmen to cut down and prepare trees, purchasing stones, and payments to stonemasons. Other events were disastrous in nature, and expenditures focused on rebuilding. Churches often had to purchase nipa, tabique, and other materials to repair portions of the church damaged and destroyed by typhoons. So you can see here for the Bacong Church, there was a typhoon in 1875, and they had to purchase 6,500 nipas to re-roof the church, which had been blown away, and it cost them 82 pesos 25 centavos. Other potentially disastrous events included the Philippine Revolution, and the Bacong Church made an empréstito, or a war loan, to Filipinas, the Spanish colonial government. I think it was 100 pesos at the end of 1897. The revolution and subsequent Philippine-American War created difficulties in the finances of the local parish churches, and parish priests ended up having to look to the local communities for support. So UP Diliman received a number of cash donations from the town itself and from individuals, including some American visitors in 1901, 1902, 1903. But the largest amounts from 1901 to 1906 came from los buenos, sensatos y obedientes católicos de esta parroquia, the good, sensible, and obedient Catholics of this parish. Sensible. The musical life of the church can also be demonstrated through expenditures. For example, this last Tuesday, I was able to see that the Basilica here probably installed a pipe organ in 1838. You can see here in January an entry for a payment to an organero, which is an organ builder. And by October of the same year, 1838, we see the first entries for an organista, the organist. Piso, 1 peso per month. So let's talk a little bit about pipe organs. Pipe organs were very expensive to maintain, and in churches where they had organs, you could see hundreds and hundreds of pesos in repairs. Often, by the later part of the 19th century, parishes often did not bother repairing their organs and instead purchased harmoniums. This one is from Archdiocesan, which are smaller reed organs with the air pressure regulated by foot pedals. You don't need to have a person pushing the big bellows. You can do it with your own feet. The reason for the switch to harmoniums from pipe organs is clear when you can see the relative prices for organs in different places in the Visayas. So see the two Bobolano organs, 1,221 pesos, 1,290 pesos, and a harmonium 150 pesos. Well, it makes sense that they would switch to the harmonium. You could buy 10 harmoniums for the price of 1 pipe organ, and they're very easy to maintain. I I can continue to give examples and statistics for several hours, but I think now you have a relatively clear picture of the current state of research in liturgical music in the Philippines. And I'm looking forward to your questions and a lively discussion. Thank you. You want to say something else? Well, I think it's not plugged in. Once we hook this other one up, we'll take questions. So you can prepare your questions, comments, violent reactions, anything you have.
You can actually ask your questions without a microphone.
You can also ask without a microphone. Who will be the first? Yes, ma'am.
Doctor, I'd like to ask why you take a particular interest in liturgical music in the Philippines. This is a minority with very Filipina. And then second, what is all these findings of your research? What does it tell about Filipinos' musical sensibilities? And you see presented particularly remarkable or different compared to, I don't know, maybe another group that you studied. What you find particularly special?
Okay, I'll answer those questions in order. My interest arises, I am very good Filipino from Davao, but my interest in liturgical music here is actually sort of separate to that. I was here with my wife and my mother in 2006, visiting. Just my mother wanted to visit the Philippines after my father died, and wanted to see the places, and said, we'll just be tourists. And because normally I was here to visit family, and we went to Colonial, and we did the chocolate hills and the tarsiers and the local river cruise and the Baclayo church, where I saw the Enamorados for the first time. And I just saw them, and I'm like, oh, of course, Spanish colonial music, that makes perfect sense. But I didn't think about it until I went back to California, where I was in my Msgr program on another subject. And my advisor asked me, for your doctoral program, what are you thinking of? And I said, I have no idea about anything, but I saw this thing in the Philippines, and it just is intriguing. And he happened to know a little bit about it, put me into contact with the scholars here. We ended up having a conference at the University of California, Riverside, where all of the major Filipino musical scholars came. We invited them and flew them out for a big conference at my university. So they all came to me. And of course, they all were interested in having me work in liturgical music here. So that was kind of the start. As to your second question, what does this tell us about Filipinos? And I don't know if I can compare liturgical music here with other places, because I'm not an expert on other places so much. What the research tells me, when I first started doing this research, and I'm reading books about it, or I'm talking to different scholars about it, often the impression I'm receiving is like this music is for Spaniards. This is not for Filipinos. This music was, performed by and for Spanish priests. The evidence is not showing that to be the case. The evidence is showing that this was performed, perhaps written, even composed, certainly performed, and certainly heard by Filipinos. So what it's telling me is that Filipinos, at least in the 19th century, in the early American period, are incredibly devout because they are in their parish churches and their devotions are spending a lot of money and a lot of effort to liturgical and devotional music, and certainly the Spanish colonial officials, including the priests, of course, are going to be very supportive of that kind of a devotion. I mean, that's of course their purpose, at least for the priests. That was their stated primary purpose for being here. I don't know if I can say any more than that. I mean, I know from personal experience that Filipinos are very musical, but I don't need to tell you that. That musicality, I think, derives. I think the Spaniards found that when they came, and I think they found a very open and enthusiastic audience to receive these kind of new musical resources, and then very soon I think the people here were take it from the Spanish and made it their own. When you look at some of the devotional materials like the Passion, coming from the chanting of the Passion of the Now, it's a distinctly Filipino devotional form. So I guess that's all I can say about that.
I had the privilege of listening to Misa Paglayana, and you saw the handwriting. And that's like a mass for the people of Paglayana. In your research here in Cebu, have you found anything like that for Archdiocesan or the Get or what?
Yes, so she was saying that the Misa Paglayana, of course, is a piece probably composed for Paglayon. I have not, well, in Cebu, there are not as many strictly musical sources as I found in Bohol from that period. Although in Aragao, for instance, I did find some written music of some gozos and devotional pieces for the different patron saints of the town. And some of them, I think, may have been written locally because even though they're written in Spanish, the name Aragao appears in the texts. It's basically saying, Gloria a ti para el pueblo Aragao. So at least the words of the tune are localized, saying like the people of Aragao praise you, O Holy Virgin, or something like that. So there is some evidence of some local composition.
As a follow-up to that, we the commission are interested because there are three towns in Cebu who were granted money for the repair of their pipe organs, like Kendall and Virgilio, as well as Colonial. So it would be very interesting to know if there is music composed for these towns, so that when the pipe organs are returned and set up in these towns, maybe somebody should play something that was written for them a long time ago.
Yeah, the local music.
Yes.
Yeah, at least in Aragao, because Aragao has a very large collection of written music.
Yeah.
I think so. That would be a wonderful opportunity. Especially, I'm looking forward to seeing the organs. I was just in Bohol yesterday, and it's sad to see the organ there. It's just a skeleton.
Yes.
Okay.
Maybe this is intended to you. We are not a composer, but we have a composer, musician, the person of lyrics to the Lord. But as I was listening to serve at the outset, the notes were somehow, when you go far, nearing to what we are right now. It's coming out as we were studying also little music. We were looking at the original, just sometimes. That's why I was asking the musician, how is he reacting to all this presentation? Because he can give us also his view, being a contemporary musician. But musician or composer were born years ago. And he must be aware about it. Dennis.
I think he's prompting you to ask a question or make a comment.
Good afternoon, Doctor. In my years of study also in music, so I encountered the same musical notation, the old one also. Now I'm curious if that's mostly unison singing. So sometimes two or three parts. So they also have in your study, do they also have 4-part singing, or do they use that during that time?
I have not run in sources here. I've not run into 4-part singing until the 20th century. It's a typical kind of parish colonial style was for 3 parts. 2 timbres or voice sopranos, and then bajo or bass. Or some, if it was in 3 parts, or if it was 2 parts, tenor and bass, or unison, coro.
So not in
usually not in 4 parts. Not here. In California missions, they have 4 parts. But here I have not run into any 4-part music until well into the 20th century. But that was very typical, even in Spain, in parish church repertory, to have 2 treble voices and then 1 male, low male voice.
Okay. Another thing is, do they really use Latin text? They don't also use Spanish text during the time.
For liturgical music, Latin exclusively, and then for devotional music, like gozos and motetes and inciensos, they're Spanish. So the last piece that we heard, the plegaria for the Lord from San Juan, was in Spanish. And
are there a lot of Spanish music? I mean,
Spanish language, very many.
In your study?
Yes, very many. Argao has a very large collection.
Another thing that I want to point out is, I'm surprised because they have budgets for musician organist before. They have like a 1 peso budget. But for now,
Still a 1 peso budget. And based on, speaking of budgets though, I did a little, I compared and contrasted when working on the budgets, and as we were just saying, as Father Brian was saying, this is still a work in progress. I mean, as of yesterday, I'm still photographing sources, and tomorrow I will go back to Barili and photograph more sources. So I'm still in the middle. I've got to go back to the Diocese of Taquedara also. So this is still a work in progress. I'm gathering lots of information, but in the 6 months I've been here, I found many important things. But I did a little research where I took maybe 1 year of different parish churches, and I just wanted to see what was the proportion of funding of their general funds that they were spending on music, so we could see how important is music in these parish churches. And remember, these are small parish churches. These are not the cathedrals. These are not some other churches. These are not the big cathedrals. These are just small, ordinary parish churches. And my average was that the churches are spending about 15% of their budget on music, which is significant. I mean, 15%, it's a large proportion, and that's between salaries and fiestas and things that are specific music expenditures. 14 to 15% is what I've been finding out. So that's something maybe you can tell your parish priest. Father Ryan.
Pretty good. Mostly of the audience this afternoon are researchers also in different fields, not necessarily in music. But again, of course, as researchers ourselves, there will be a lot of choice and as well as frustrations in our research. And then just mentioning our joys, of course, if we are finding something that are really relevant to our topic, of course, it would be very of great use and of great help to us. But of course, our research is a really detective work. There will also be frustrations along the way. As a researcher in this field, maybe perhaps it's better for us to hear your frustrations that you have met along the way in your research for how many years, and of course how we were able to overcome them and somehow offset with other ways and methods in order for you to really get pertinent information that are really meaningful and necessary for your research. Of course, there are a lot of researchers here and in your talk. The rest of other data is also a researcher.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm going to be like Father Virgilio and tell about the successes and the failures. Well, one of the frustrations, actually part of, I guess part of my own growth as a researcher is when I first started researching, I don't want to say full-time, when I first started seriously researching in 2008, I was only interested in musical manuscripts, just notes on the page, and if they didn't have that, I would be like, I don't want to see that. Until I've realized in the last several years that the records, the ones that I showed you at the end of my talk about the expenditures, are actually in many cases more important because they're giving you the life of the parish church over maybe 100 years or 150 years. So part of it is the successes and failures is that I've come to understand the importance of other kinds of resources. So my advice for those of you who are performing research is there can be many resources. So among the frustrations, potential frustrations, like in the Diocese of Diliman, they have very few musical manuscripts, and also they also have very few of these parish records, receipt records. But the Cultural Heritage Chair there, what he did when I was there 4 months ago, is he set up interviews with the choir directors and the old cantoras from that place. And I met maybe half a dozen cantoras who were over 90 years old. And so they were alive in the 1920s, and their parents and grandparents were alive during the Spanish colonial period. And some of these cantoras, I remember one from Kanhai, 93 years old, still can sing, still is the organist of the church on times when nobody shows up. And she and I were singing Latin songs together. She remembers all her solfeggio exercises, do, mi, re, fa, mi, sol, fa. We sang them all together. Wonderful, amazing lady. And she remembers the huge 1925 earthquake that destroyed many of the churches in Negros. And she, of course, remembers World War II and everything that happened. And so she knew all the names of the masses that they used to sing. So that is an oral history that I think is equally important to the written histories, because from the different cantoras that I met, I now know what the repertories around the turn of the century were at the end of the Spanish colonial and the beginning of the American period, because they remembered all of them. Oh yeah, the Misa and Fa by Bordesi, and this one, and so I'm furiously writing them down. So that is those are secondary or primary. Other primary sources you could use when you can't find documentation. Another frustration is just related to the destruction of sources. I'll tell you a story. In 2008, when I'm looking for cantorales in Bohol, I went to the parish of Biniao, and we're looking around, and we're waiting for the parish priest to come, and there's some older people in the parish who were talking with my wife and I. And we're asking, oh, do you remember these cantorales? And one of the older ladies was like, oh yeah, I know those, I remember those. oh, in the 1960s we still had them, although we didn't know what they were. So we would take them and put them on the ground for a kneeling bench. When it was raining, we would tear the page out for a payong. The fishermen would wrap fish in the market. They're gone now. She says like, oh, I remember those, but we didn't know what they were. So those are frustrations. So I can write down in the book, I know the parish of Nino had a set of cantoradas, but I mean, I'm never going to find them. They're all gone. So those are frustrations that we have. I mean, other potential frustrations can be just issues of access, especially when archival materials are in private hands. When they've very often musical instruments and musical manuscripts, that used to be in the parish church have now kind of gone down to the family of whoever the maestros, the music people were, and so sometimes they are not wanting to show those. Most of the time they are. Most of the time they're very happy for someone to be interested. But I'm sure in all different kinds of research that you engage in, if things are in private collections and private hands, that makes it a difficulty. Actually, working in liturgical music for me has been very easy because what with the diocesan and archdiocesan hierarchies, access is usually a very simple thing. You ask Father Brian to set it up for you, and Gerard helps you set it up, and then you go over there, you drive over there, and everything is ready. So I've been very fortunate. Again, success. I've been very fortunate that access has not been a difficult for me, except when it's in private hands. Then access can be difficult. Sometimes people want money for you to see them, and they wonder, what is your purpose? What are you going to do with this information? So that can be difficult.
Any more questions? Okay.
For practitioners. These are singers.
Good afternoon, Dr. Kendall. My name is Kendall. I'm not exactly a researcher. I'm more of a practitioner, a newbie practitioner of Gregorian chant. We heeded the decree of the Second Vatican Council, particularly Sacrosanctum to restore Gregorian chant to its proper place in the liturgy of the Roman Rite. And so we are struggling. We are basement scholar. We practice at the basement. There are only a few of us. We are struggling. And I noticed in your presentation that the state of church music in the Philippines, in the Visayas, more or less, lead more towards devotions rather than the liturgy. And the Second Vatican Council, I suppose, wanted to restore the sense of the sacred back to the liturgy. And I suppose that was also the reason that it reaffirmed that Latin is to be preserved as the official language of the liturgy, and Gregorian chant specifically as the music suitable and proper to the Roman Rite. And it required also that Gregorian chant be the first choice, Principem Locum Opinion. Given the first choice, it was mistranslated as given pride of place, but the Latin says it should be given first. It should be made first choice. What can you say to a struggling group of non-singers who train themselves to read Gregorian hymns, to learn the ancient manuscripts of Kendall and Down, to bring back and to obey the decree of the Second Vatican Council? That's my first question. And I may have a follow-up question.
Perseverance. We were speaking just before the presentation, and I was trying to give them a little bit of hope for their project because, they're doing their best to restore the Gregorian chant to the place that it has and that it should. It is the cultural musical patrimony of the church. When you think of, all of modern music, when you think of, even if you go to popular music, all of modern music notated modern music has its roots somehow in Gregorian chant. It really is the father or the mother of all of Western modern music. So it has, I think, a very important place. I was mentioning to him, they were asking, how, give us some hope. And I said, well, I was telling them about in the Diocese of Dumaguete, there are 3 or 4 parish churches where the very, very strong-willed choir directors are demanding that Latin and Latin only is being sung when they direct. Not necessarily, they're not really singing Gregorian chant, but they are moving toward the direction. I think 1 or 2 of them are chanting. But they're doing their very best to restore Latin to its proper place. It may not be a quick process, but I think it's something by small gradients. I mean, having the support of the lay and the parish officials, and of course the parish priest and the diocese and hierarchies is important also. I'm not sure of the proper. I think if it is done well. If it is done and done well, then people will say, like, I want to hear more of that. And if it's not done well, then people will be ambivalent. So it's something that, my old teachers told me is do your work and do it well. And then that will create more opportunities for you. So if you do the very best you possibly can, and give it the dignity and seriousness that it deserves, that I know that you're giving to it, people will really say, like, wow, there's something going on here. That's important. But I don't have an answer for you that will change the culture of the last 50 years overnight.
Yes, that's my second question. That's what my second question is all about. Because you began with up to the 1840s, right? That's the first category according to guideline for 1840s. And I noticed that the compositions were localized. Most were made by the Spanish friars. Some were made by Filipinos. I saw a few late chants, but I saw very, very rare, in your slides, I saw very rare instances of Gregorian melodies. They are actually invented melodies. I'm not sure though, I'm not a music expert. I'm not sure if they're based on Gregorian melodies, which, according to Pope Pius X, the more closely a piece of composition, whether polyphony or plain song, reaches the kind of melody that is embedded in Gregorian chant, the more sacred it is, and more fitting it is for sacred liturgy. We have a flourishing industry here in composing church music, very beautiful pieces. As we can see from the 1840s, even up to 2016, they are very beautiful compositions. But I have yet to see a composition composed by a local, a Filipino maybe, that approaches the kind of noble simplicity that is manifested by Gregorian chant. Is there a way that such research undertakings such as this could help stimulate composers to compose in a beautiful manner described by Musicam Sacram and the Musica Sacra et Sacra Liturgical?
What you were talking about, Pius X, that was the 1903 Motu Proprio?
Yes.
As it approaches the... That's again another question, I think, for Filipino composers. We can get to start writing Gregorian style melodies. His children are students at UP, both of them. Well, that's a good question. As far as what I showed, probably in sources in the Philippines, the majority of them are plain chants. As far as ones that are strictly Gregorian, from the Gregorian repertoire, I know I haven't done a really close analysis of the plain chants. My analysis has been more for canto figurado. But I know the Misa or Mis Factor is in these. You can find the melody of the Misa or Mis Factor there. Which one? I'd have to look at it. But I can also share with you some of these sources if you would like to see them, so that you could look at them for yourselves. And then remember also that at a time that these sources are being made, it's early 19th century, and that the sources that they're probably being copied from are probably late 18th century. And the state of chanting is at a very low ebb at that time. I mean, that was one reason why the late 19th century Solemn Revival, I mean, everyone was complaining in the 18th and 19th century that the state of plain chant had gone to a very low level. So, but that's still the chant, that low level chanting. It's maybe not pure, but despite that, it is what was sung and heard by millions of Filipinos as their kind of daily spiritual or weekly spiritual bread. But if you'd like afterwards, I can see about sharing with you some of the I've taken tens of thousands of archival photographs. I have no problem sharing those if you want to do some further research.
Yeah, just one more question.
Good afternoon. I'm from the Conservatory of Music, and I am a musician. So, I just have a reaction about this kind of Gregorian chant is easy to play or easy to perform, because I think that some questions are relating to performance practice of this kind. For me, I'm a teacher. I didn't offer this kind of composition. You must first learn the different modes. That's the one used before the stage. And four voices are not being particularly used in those eras, because it is in the Baroque era or the counterpoint. For me, that is much more difficult than four voices that we are used to in our churches today. So how do you describe the method of performance practice? Because for me as a musician, it is difficult to play in an era that we are not used to performing like that. Because we have there's a reaction that it is just an easy task to perform these kinds of materials. But for us practitioners of music, it takes us 5 to 10 years to perform these kinds of work, especially for composers of Baroque period.
I agree with you, Father. Despite the fact that it's just one single line and it looks to be very simple, at a superficial level, but that's a superficial assessment. It is difficult to do properly. Yes, certainly the modal system. For those of you who are musicians, we have a system of major and minor keys. This predates that. You have to know your Dorian and your Phrygian and your Mixolydian and your Lydian modes, which are different altogether. They have different rules. And then, of course, the knowledge of the liturgy and of Latin and of those kinds of performance practices are important. And it's true that doing the older music does require a new set of skills. It's actually an old set of skills, but it'll be new for most of as you know, for the practitioners. It's a new set of skills that are very old. One thing that's made it easier is actually to go back to the old treatises and see how, because those old treatises, like the one that the Marcus Inavis 1777 that's found here in the Philippines, those were used as teaching tools from the priests to the parishioners or the priests to other priests. And so their method of teaching, I think, is important. Their method of pedagogy is important. So, returning to some of those sources, which you can find on Google Books, there are dozens of them. Just look for Colonial, and you'll find 20 or 30 treatises on Google Books from the 1550s until almost 1900. And you can see, just even if you don't read Spanish, you can just see by the exercise that they have kind of a pedagogical method, and you can sing through them and start to get an idea of the sense. But I agree with you, Father, that it is a completely different concept of music and a completely different method. And even though it's old, it does require very new things to do. So So I can commiserate with that.
Thank you. It's already
I'm fine.
for those who have, that's going to help people here who have other audience today's recess. Fine, so it's fine.
We can continue talking about it.
You can continue your conversation afterwards because there's snacks
Ah, yes.
for everybody.
That's the important part of this.
Yes. Please, let's give a hand for presentation this afternoon. It might be quite new for us. This study of this whole music might be quite new for most of us because we edifying afternoon. Second, we're interested in our music, church music. And let's also give a hand to ourselves. Thank all of you for coming this afternoon. It's good. We have a full house and we're all glad of that. Now I'd like to call all the members of the commission to please stand in front. I don't have to call you one by one. Picture. You have one to give a gift. Professor Kendall. But Brian doesn't want to give it over.